in a way, I think I was probably looking for that connectedness with myself again, which is why I did it really quietly. There wasn't the record, there wasn't the same interest, but, I'm still someone that does like to do what I do and pursue that thing. I'd been in adventure all my life prior to Everest, and there was something about doing that trip, I think, that was going to help me connect with myself again and this thing that I love to do.
So I would love to start with a quote from your book, The Girl Who Climbed Everest. It's been said that fear and limits are just illusions. That's something I believe. Some of the most memorable and rewarding moments of my life so far are those where I was pushing my limits beyond what I once thought they were. We all have things that scare us, but in order to grow and become a better person, we have to confront them. So Alyssa, talk to me about being 8 years old and first moving into the space of achieving what was at that point pushing the idea of limitation both for others and yourself.
Yeah, so my first real big challenge in my life was crossing the Kokoda Track. And I remember, doing a year of lead-up training. I was fascinated by Kokoda. I'd heard about it a lot. I knew a lot of people who had done it. And there was something about this place that I found really fascinating. And as an 8-year-old, got the opportunity to trek across the Kokoda Track. And in hindsight, had no real idea of what I was walking into. But, I did have this belief in myself that I could do it. And, I flew over to Port Moresby in August of 2005. But, the feeling of actually landing at the start of the track, and just sort of trying to imagine what you're about to walk into. And over the next 8 days, it's some of the steepest terrain ever. There's nothing like it in Australia. And you're spending 8 to 10 hours a day, just 2 hours of uphill, 2 hours of downhill at a time. It was incredibly challenging, but I remember getting to the arches at Owa's Corner at the end of Kokoda, and that feeling was huge, knowing I'd invested, 2 years of my life. And for me, it was a big deal that I guess I sort of proved to myself what I was capable of. There were a lot of people that sort of wrote me off because of my age, and I was very, very small as an 8-year-old. So I probably looked about 5 or 6. And so many people just wrote me off straight away. And I really remember that being a defining thing during that phase of my life. Because I naively, when I set the goal, thought, oh, well, I've got as much chance as anyone else. And I'd really been raised in a family that sort of put that belief in my head. My father, definitely, he was very particular about not allowing excuses. And if you want to go and do something, all right, well, what is the work required? And if you're willing to put in that work, then why can't you do it? So I really had that mentality, and then was confronted with people going, you're not going to be able to cross the track. And I actually remember an incident when we landed in Port Moresby the night before we actually started trekking. And there was a guy who was a part of the bigger team that we were with. We had a small group of us that knew each other, and then we were part of a bigger trip of about 20 people. And one of the guys who was a lot older, said in front of me to my dad, he's like, oh, you're kidding if you think she's going to make it. And I remember actually a really, now that I look back at it, sort of pivotal conversation that I had with my dad is we got up to the hotel room to get packed and everything. And I just said to him, why do people think that I can't do it? And he explained it to me, and he was saying, look, he's probably nervous himself. This is challenging for anyone wanting to do Kokoda. And he doesn't want to look at you as this little 8-year-old girl and think, oh, she's going to cross the track. It's quite confronting to think that, and then they probably don't understand why you believe you can do it and where that confidence comes from. Because I was tiny, but I was like, yep, I'm going to do it. So, but the fact that he explained that to me was really helpful. And I sort of lent on that throughout the years as I was climbing as well. And it helped me understand that it's really not up to them whether I'm capable of something or not, or to decide that for me. It's up to me to go and, pursue what is of interest to me, and I guess sort of find that limit if it is there. And, my process doesn't really have anything to do with whether they think I can do it, particularly if I'm willing to sort of put myself into it and have a go. So, yeah, that was just such an eye-opening trip going to Kokoda, and I think very much changed my perception of me and what I'm capable of, and understanding how much of it is a mental game. Physically every day it was incredibly challenging, but you just find ways to break it down. You get into this rhythm of focusing on getting it out of your tent in the morning, getting all the little tasks done. You don't always want to get out of bed early in the morning, but once you get up into it, you feel great. And you break it down and just focus on, this particular hill today, or, the next little section. So I do believe Kokoda was really the foundation for everything else that I went to do later on. But yeah, it was an 8-day trip, but what you learn and what you pack in that 8 days was huge.
That's it. It's enormous for an 8-year-old to sort of be working through that mindset at such a young age. Like, I find it really interesting because I'm just trying to imagine like being an adult, and because the Kokoda is massive for people to do, right? And
I think often when you say I was 8, it can sort of give people the wrong perception. Like, this thing is really challenging. Like, I respect anyone who does the track. It's not easy. And I've seen, grown men in their 30s, 40s struggle. So it's an endurance challenge, and it's pretty much the whole time you're there, you're either going on a really steep uphill or a really steep downhill, and it wears on you. Like, it's tough.
Yeah. And to I guess to be in a position where, I don't know, is it like a feeling of resentment that you felt from people? Like, is it in your experience? Because I know that in reading your book also, you were actually bullied by people in doing something like this. Where do you think that comes from?
Yeah, that's something that, like, I've had a lot of conversations, particularly when I was very young, with my father about, because I think there was a little bit of resentment. And when I was younger, like going through school and all of that, I did have issues with bullying, which I didn't really understand at the time, because I was actually, whilst I was confident and I liked taking on these challenges, I was actually quite reserved, was very quiet, was more the sort of put my head down and just do my thing. So I didn't really bother anybody. But I still, had some people sort of go out of their way. It made me a little bit of a target to be doing these things, because the town that I grew up in, Toowoomba, particularly back then, was a really small town. And I think with that can come some negativity, because, and I remember my dad explaining this to me when I was very young as well, because I started to get some negative reactions, I think you can start to think, should I be doing this, or am I doing something wrong? Or like, it's natural to want to be accepted, I think. But I was so passionate and I loved what I was doing. So there was this conflict of like, it's creating a lot of friction in my life and a lot of problems I don't really want, but I love what I get to do. And he said to me, look, that's natural. There is a pack mentality, particularly when you're in school, and fitting in is a very big deal. And when you start to come up out of that, it threatens people. Like, they're going to try and drag you back into their level, because it makes them go, well, could I be doing more? It makes them question things about themselves, about their own limits, and why do you have the confidence to go and do that? So being aware of that was huge. And I then understood, like, I have a choice here. Yes, it would make things easier if I sort of sink back in, but truthfully, is that who I want to be in the long run? Am I going to miss out on all of these experiences that I love doing just so I don't, sort of stand out too much? And I think too, when I was on a lot of these trips, I'm around people a lot older than me at that age, and you'd hear a lot of their conversations, and they'd talk about when they were younger, wishing that they hadn't worried about fitting in. Like, I hear it time and time and time again. So I sort of would hear that and go, yes, it's uncomfortable right now, but in the long run, I'm going to regret it if I don't pursue this. And I realized pretty quickly standing out will actually become an asset at some point. And so, yeah, it made school uncomfortable in a lot of ways, but yeah, for what I got to do, I felt like it was worth it.
And did you feel like, because again, I read in your book, the word loner kept popping up as a descriptive word for you. Is that something that you identify with sort of going through that experience?
Yeah, absolutely. I would say I was a loner, particularly throughout that period of my life. And I'd say that sort of conflict had a lot to do with it. I think I recognized that was kind of part of what I was doing. Yes, it's this huge honor to get to be so young at this level, having these opportunities, that a lot of people in the adventure industry dream of doing someday. I had it sort of at my disposal. I felt very lucky for that, but I was like, I can't, it got to a point where I couldn't have it both ways. I couldn't, go and do this and really pursue it, but also care what people in high school thought of me. And I think when I was very young, up until sort of mid-high school, before then, I sort of had two separate worlds and I kept them separate from each other. So I had my adventure life, but when I was at school, I didn't really like to talk about it or, again, stand out too much. But it came to a point where I sort of had to pick one and go, are you going to go all in at this or again, sink back in? So, yeah, but loner would be accurate for that period of my life, definitely.
Mm-hmm. And so when you were 14, you climbed Mount Kilimanjaro. And I mention this because, to my understanding, you had a fairly similar experience. Obviously, you were sort of 6 years older, but kind of the same thing in terms of having to make that choice of okay, I'm going into this adventure space. I'm going to do new things, but this is essentially meaning that I'm still sort of going out on my own. Is that how you experienced it?
Absolutely. I'd say when I went to Kilimanjaro, and even throughout the year of training I did in the lead up to that one, I was at a real crossroads that was sort of coming for a while where, like I said, those two worlds couldn't really be separated anymore. And particularly with, I started to have ambitions of going to bigger mountains, if that was a possibility. And that's something that you have to be all in on. So I couldn't really manage those sort of two separate compartments anymore. And I was just feeling quite frustrated. I was really having a hard time in school because I was a loner and I was someone who, really just put my head down and worked and wasn't super social. But, for me, it was because I had that sense of community within adventure. But, the school didn't really understand that. So at the time, it created a lot of issues. They wanted me to be more normal, to hang out with people my own age. But at that point, particularly with all of my experiences, like how do you fit in to normal? Like I just wasn't interested in it. So I was like, look, what annoyed me the most was I was a very dedicated student and I actually liked school. But they were so focused on the fact that I wasn't doing normal school, like after school activities or hanging out with people my own age. And I was focused on adventure that it got to a point where it was actually easier for me to leave and do like distance education because then I could focus on the school and not have to give up the thing that I was passionate about and had gotten to quite a high level at. So that sort of decision came together when I went to Mount Kilimanjaro. It was actually great. I had a couple of weeks over there where I really had a lot of time to think and just, think about my life back home and think about what I really wanted. And it's actually the place where I came to the decision that, Everest really popped into my mind. And I'd had a fascination with Everest since I was like 6, even before I did Kokoda. I think I'd read about it at school or something, being the highest mountain in the world. And I'd had some exposure to that, like getting into trekking. I remember we used to go into the gear store to get trekking gear and there'd be all these like famous elite Australian mountain climbers who were climbing Everest and K2 and all these other mountains in Nepal and the Himalaya. And I just became fascinated with that. And I, thought, oh, maybe one day I could do that. So being on Kilimanjaro was the point where I went, I think that's for me. And I don't know how I'm going to do it, but I would like to go and take on these bigger mountains and there was just something calling me to it. So having that time on Kilimanjaro where you're pushing yourself hard and you're in your own head a lot, I think you get a lot of time to understand you and what you want. So I came back from that trip, with that purpose in mind of like, I'm going to climb Everest. Yeah.
So when you were climbing Mount Kilimanjaro and you're sort of in your head, because it is a lot of time where you've got your self-talk going the entire time. Like, what's going through your mind?
So for me at that point, I think I was sort of thinking about a lot of my life back home at different points, but it's a mix of things. I mean, sometimes you're so in the moment, particularly if there's a really challenging day where you're not feeling great or there's a particularly tough section, you'll just sort of slow everything down and focus on your steps and what you're doing. We also had like a group of sort of 8 other Australians, so you might talk sometimes depending on how tough the climbing is. And then other times I would definitely sort of think through my life so far and then, where do I want it to go next? Because I was not excited about the idea of returning to normal schooling. And I sort of was like in this middle ground where I thought, it's really challenging for me to fit in. I don't feel like I fit there. I think there's something more out there for me and I want to at least pursue it. I don't necessarily know if that's going to come off or where it goes, but I just felt like I wanted to do more and started looking at my options. And, for me, that became Everest. Before then, I had an interest in joining the army. So either way, I just knew Toowoomba wasn't for me. Going back to normal schooling wasn't for me. I was willing to work hard and, it wasn't laziness for not wanting to be at school, but I just went, there's got to be something more out there that I can do. And, Kilimanjaro gave me that time in my own head to sort of analyze that and go, that's not me. That's not for me. Now I'm going to go this way. So it was a really good trip for me.
Do you remember the specific moment that you were like, yeah, Everest is something that I'm going to do?
So it was on the way down, but I remember this specific moment going up. We might have been on day 4. So we were getting close to being near the top. It was probably the day before we actually went for the summit. And there was just sort of a moment where, I was looking at my options and something about Everest definitely came up. And again, I think being over there, you've drowned out a lot of the noise of, society telling you what you need to be, what you need to do. And just sort of, it gave me the time to go, what do I want? And I remember that specific moment where the idea of Everest came up and Kilimanjaro was one of my favorite trips and it was because it was in the mountains. And I just realized that's something I'm really passionate about. And being out there is, when I started to remember how inspired I was by Everest from the time I first heard about it. And I realized I always wanted to do this at some point in my life. So I'd say it was on the way up during that moment that Everest came to mind. And then I was sort of mulling it over for the next few days and, focusing on the climb that we were doing. And then it was on the way back down and getting back to the hotel in Africa where I went, I think that's what I'm going to do. Like I was actually like, I'm going to make a plan around this. So there were a few points throughout that trip that Everest just kept being a thing for me. Yeah.
And did you feel like when you're mulling about this, is it sort of like driven by this strong sense of certainty, or were you having moments of like popping up, sort of almost imposter syndrome? Like, who do you think you are at 14 thinking that soon enough you'll be on the top of Everest?
Definitely wasn't certainty for me. They were just sort of these thoughts that kept popping up and something I was really interested in, but it seemed like a world away from what I was at that point. It wasn't like I'm just going to go across to Everest. And I was thinking through, who am I to think I can do that? Like, I performed well on Kilimanjaro, but to give it some context, the summit of Kilimanjaro is not even Camp 1 on Everest. Like it's nothing compared to, and even the climbing along the way is harder because on Everest your gear is heavier, there's a lot more snow, there's more risk, so there's so much more going on. But I think, I am very analytical and I would just sort of run through and I go, well, you know what? I've been there before. It may not have been that magnitude, but I've had doubts every trip. There's times where, particularly when everyone's telling you you're not going to be able to do that, where you do sort of have that thought of, am I kidding myself here? So there was definitely moments of that, but I thought I've always grown into it through that process. So why can't I grow into that next level if I'm willing to give it the time and energy that it needs? And that was kind of, what drove the decision to actually commit to it. I knew I had a long process ahead of me. I didn't know when I was going to climb Everest, could be in 5, 10 years, whatever, but I wanted to start, moving toward it.
And how did it go telling your dad that this was your next goal?
His reaction was actually quite funny. Like, the rest of my family were not impressed. But he was, not emotional in any way about it. He was kind of similar to what he'd been with other trips, in that he's always said, I don't want to encourage you, but I don't want to discourage you. I'm not going to pave the way for you. I'm not going to try and make it easier or whatever, but I'm also not going to hold you back in life. If you want to go and do something, I'll support you in any way I can, but then the rest is up to you. So, he, to his credit, really stayed true to that. I was really honest with him and said, when we got home, I was like, I want to climb Everest. And he was like, okay, and then sort of sat down and went, if you really want to do this, you need to be aware of everything that can go wrong, all the risks. It's going to be a really tough process, like really understand what you're walking into. If you're okay with all of that, then go for it and we'll do what we can to make it happen. I can't promise you that it will, but he offered his full support. But certainly the rest of my family they sort of just stayed out of it, but I know they weren't happy about me pursuing that.
What was that like for you, sort of, because it's quite fascinating in your family. You have like this, your dad who is so strong in his conviction of like, if you want to do this, I will be there to support you. But as you said, I'm not going to pave the way for you. And then the rest of your family kind of potentially more fearful about the situation. How do you balance that at such a young age?
That was a massive challenge for me. There were a lot of changes going on in my life at that time. So this was right around the time, probably slightly before this, that my parents had actually split. So it was probably a little bit before I went to Kilimanjaro. They had split. I'd moved in with my dad and then had shared custody and all that sort of thing. So it was definitely tough, and it created some issues within the family. Like, it sort of isolated me from a lot of my family because they didn't really get it. They didn't understand. I don't think they wanted to know, the risks I was taking, the training I was doing. They were just concerned. But, it definitely was conflicting for me because at that age I had to be really committed to, what it took to climb Everest. And I knew I worked out pretty quickly, you're all in or you're not. You don't want to go over there not being 100%. So, my home life at that time I found really challenging, and I found that having that training process for Everest was actually really cathartic. It helped me deal with a lot of other things in my life that, particularly at that age, you don't really feel like you have any control over a lot of the personal stuff that's happening. So for me, it was actually a way, it was an outlet as well. But it was definitely a conflicting time for me personally.
So between Kilimanjaro and your first attempt on Everest, how much space was that between that time?
So that was about 3 years. So I was 14 when I went to Kilimanjaro, and then I had my first attempt on Everest at 17. So lots of physical training in that time, but I got the opportunity here and there where we could to go on some expeditions and then also work with different mentors and things like that to try and make sure that I'm at the standard that I needed to be at. But 3 years later, I was the first attempt on Everest.
So how do you maintain like commitment? Like 3 years is huge. That's a huge build up in moving towards a goal.
It is. I think it's so easy in 3 years to get complacent because it's so easy to go, it's like 3 years away, but you actually need to be really progressing throughout that 3 years, particularly because, like I said, I wasn't at the level that I needed to be at. So I really needed to like grow into it. For me, it was putting where I could the right people around me. I didn't have a ton of support, probably less than maybe what people would think. But I had the right people around me. So my father, definitely, he was someone that would kind of oversee things, particularly at the beginning. It was kind of just he and I. So he would initially set my training programs, and he would be someone that I would kind of strategize about it with and go, look, this is where I'm at. What do you think I need to do? That sort of thing. And then as it progressed on, I had to go outside of that and find other people, which he actually suggested to me, because it got to a point where he said, you know, I'm still your father. So there is sometimes that desire to like give you a way out, or you're in pain or whatever. He even said there was a particular day on Kilimanjaro that was really tough, and summit night was tough. And he said, you know, there were times where I asked you, do you want to go back down? And you said no. And he said, I wouldn't have given that way out to anyone else. I would have made them say to me, I want to go back down. So he's like, because you're my daughter, I don't want to see you like that. But if you're going to be an Everest Summiteer, you have to be in that space and not give yourself a way out and sort of learn from it. So he then sort of outsourced that and went, oh, all right, you need to go and work with this person. So it was kind of his recommendations that, kind of put this team around me of people to help refine me. I felt like I had what it took internally. I looked at people who had climbed Everest and I thought, yes, that's incredibly tough, but I don't think they want it more than me. I don't think they're willing to do the work that I'm not willing to do. I mean, I'm willing to do what it takes to get to that level. And so from that point on, you just need the right people around you to help sort of guide you in that direction. But, you know, I didn't really go to a lot of mountaineers necessarily. Like, I learned the basic skills from some instructors like over in New Zealand and that. But the reason I didn't really go into the mountaineering community was, you know, it wasn't like there was a lot of acceptance for a teenage girl to go up and climb Everest. So I had to be really careful with that. You know, it's easy to surround yourself with the wrong people who maybe don't necessarily want you to succeed. And I experienced that with Kokoda. So I was very particular about who I took my advice from. I needed people who, you know, knew what they were talking about in terms of like, I'm going into a life and death environment. I have to be mentally and physically strong, but who also, you know, didn't have a biased opinion on whether I could do it or not, didn't really have an agenda, didn't want to stop me from doing it. They had to, respect me and give me a fair shot. So I went to people that actually didn't know me at the time. So one of those people who's a good friend of mine now is Keith Fennell. So he was 21 when he passed SAS selection in Australia. And so he understood that too, because at the time he had the same thing. It's like, no way, you're not experienced enough. You won't be able to take that on. So he sort of understood that process that I was going through. I got flown down to Sydney to go and do a training camp with him, and I didn't know what that meant, and I didn't know him. And it was really good though, because he did push me physically, but, you know, there were a few different tests in terms of like abseiling. He wanted to test, could I push through fear? We'd have conversations around just strategies on how to handle life on Everest, and when something goes wrong, how do you react to that situation? So I had some really good people around me, but that sort of came about because my father initially, you know, for the first year, he sort of oversaw my training, but then he was like, you now have to go to other people. And right before I had my first attempt on Everest, I got the opportunity to go and climb in the Andes, which was one of my favorite trips to this day, but it was really tough. It's a mountain that a lot of people underestimate. It's the highest mountain in the Andes, called Aconcagua, and it's one of the 7 summits, but just really volatile weather. Like, it's a great expedition training ground because, you just get the discomfort that comes with life on expedition. So the idea of that one, though, is I was invited by the same team I was looking at climbing Everest with, and they said, come to this mountain, join this expedition if you can. It'll test all of your training, and then we'll be able to see how you perform. And if we're happy with how you perform, then you can come to Everest. So it was kind of the final piece of this 3 years where, like, if I do well on this climb, I then get to go and have a go at Everest. So it was really good. I felt really strong and performed. And so, then got the offer to join them literally a couple months later on Everest in Nepal.
And so moving into Everest, because I know that I very much resonated with you in this aspect, you had a journal of quotes that you would pull on.
Yeah, so that's pretty traditional for me for any major expedition that I go on. I have just these little, really small, like notebooks, and any quotes that I've sort of found, particularly when I'm like throughout that training process and I'm starting to get into that mindset of really trying to push past your limits. There's like, if there's things that I read, whether that's online or in books, that really resonate with me and kind of sum up, why I'm doing this. I'll just sort of jot down little bits here or there. And then when I'm ready to go on the expedition, I've got that with me. And it's just a good reminder, particularly when you're isolated, you're living in base camp or in the mountains for 2 months at a time. There are times where, you're just dealing with the day-to-day, like massive efforts and discomforts. And I find like coming back to base camp between climbs, I would sort of read that, check in with that, remind myself of why I was there. And that was enough for me to like go, yep, I don't care about the discomfort. I understand why I'm doing this. That was a really powerful thing for me to have. So I've taken that on every major expedition I've ever had.
And is there a main person and or quote that you tend to always kind of pull on? Is there like one personal quote that you depend on that really puts you in that state that's necessary?
There's actually not one. I've had there's a few that consistently popped up. And now that you've asked me, I've drawn a blank. But there's a few that have stood out to me that tend to be pretty consistently across there. But it can be completely random. Sometimes I'll hear music that I'm listening to where there's a particular line and I go, I really love that. And I'll just like quickly jot that down, or even in movies or stuff like that kind of sum up for me. But not off the top of my head. There's not like one. But I will just sort of jot those down as I go along.
So we're at Everest, attempt 1. How are you feeling? What's going on?
It was pretty surreal because I'd imagined that moment a lot and what it feels like to actually leave for the real thing. But at the end of a 3-year training process where this was very much my life every day, I was so ready to go. I wanted to put all of that to the test, and I was sort of on a bit of a high after really performing quite strongly in the Andes. It made me really confident that, hey, I could actually do this. So I flew into Kathmandu over in Nepal, and I always love being over there. And just a lot of nerves, a lot of excitement that I actually now get to have my own experience here because, it was cool to read about other people's experiences, particularly in the early days where I was trying to get a sense of what it's like to climb Everest and what I was walking into. But now that I was here, it was pretty surreal knowing I now get to go and have my own experience on this mountain.
Mm-hmm. And sort of where's your head at the moment? Are you feeling really confident in yourself that like this is it, this is going to happen? Or is there sort of, there's a big difference between making a decision of I'm going to do this to literally being at sort of, I guess, the base camp of Everest and about to go further than you've ever been in that location?
I was probably like, it's a process, but I think like walking into it when I was at the start point of that expedition, I was confident. I was like 90% sure I think this is going to happen. I felt really good about my training and my preparation. And then we did the trek into base camp. But, there's always that percentage of doubt, I think, particularly when you're trekking to base camp and you look up at the magnitude of Everest and you think it's big until you're literally standing at the foot of it and you're trying to imagine us being up there in the next few weeks. So definitely nervous. There's an element of doubt there, but going into that first one, I was quite confident that I had it if everything was going to come together.
And how were you being received there? Because obviously there's more people than just the team of people that you've gone there with. When people come up to you and sort of ask, what you're doing here and that you're going to push for the summit, how are people receiving you?
Kind of mixed. So it's pretty like similar to a lot of what I'd experienced before then. because this was such a massive climb. So yeah, I was a bit reserved, and I knew people were a bit skeptical of me, and, can she carry a pack? And these people didn't know me. They didn't know any of my history or experience and all of that. And I knew when people saw me perform that they were like, oh, wow, you're actually quite strong. But yeah, going into Everest, I felt like they were definitely a bit skeptical of me. And I think that made me, and I've gotten quite good at this, a little bit reserved. Just kind of kept to myself. I knew, like, I'll come into my own when we start climbing. But yeah, I don't think they were super confident straight off the bat. So I was always aware of that. I often felt like I had to be a little bit more careful maybe than most people of, like, everyone has a bad day or two on a really long expedition. You have a day where you hit the wall mentally. At some point, everyone does. But I often felt like I couldn't show that because I didn't want them to have any more doubt in their mind about whether I was capable of being there. So, you do have a team dynamic, but I often felt like I sort of had to still keep to myself a little bit to not have them doubt my ability.
And how did you feel being that internal? Like, was there a part of you that kind of wished that you could, like, express yourself more?
Absolutely. And I did receive, like, comments like that from the team from time to time of like, oh, people want to get to know you more. And I would have loved to been a little bit more open and just, this is who I am sort of thing. But I knew from previous experience, and yeah, I could just sort of sense if I give away too much, particularly like I'm not capable of handling this or being weak, it'll be an issue. I felt like I didn't have sort of the leeway that other people had maybe. So it actually would have been less stressful to not have to be on guard and to think about that. I think if I'd felt like we were all at, the start position exactly the same, and like, say I was 30 at the time, I don't think it would have been an issue. But yeah, it's actually partially exhausting to have to protect that, particularly when you're in an environment where you're going to be exposed anyway. You're going to have to push yourself, and I think someone's character comes out, when you do. But yeah, definitely being in base camp, that was a challenge. In hindsight, was like having to just sort of watch how much I revealed about how I was feeling or how I was doing. And it would have been a lot easier to be a bit more open.
Yeah, that's a massive added element of where your, like, attention, focus and energy is going when about to do something so big.
Yeah, definitely. And I don't think I appreciated that as much at the time. I look back on it now and think it was a massive element of pressure. And then there's the media as well. Pre and post expedition, particularly as you're about to leave, there's some press around what you're doing. Particularly for me, being a teenage girl, people sort of wanted to know, why are you going to go and climb Everest? And there was a potential record. So that's an added element to it where, and I certainly saw this later on while climbing, I can't just slink away and go, okay, my expedition's done. It would be noted if I didn't succeed at it or whatever. So you feel that as well. And again, I don't think I appreciated that pressure, but I sort of felt like there was always a piece of me that had to be kept to myself. And yeah, that does wear on you over time.
And do you feel like that has transformed now that you're older? You're able to be yourself a lot more?
Definitely. I'd say probably more recently, sort of in the last probably year, I would say that. Up until then, I still probably felt like I had to be a little bit guarded. But now that I'm older, and I think you can own who you are a little bit more, I definitely think now I'm less guarded. And particularly since being back from Everest and, having people in my life who know me, and slowly, like, it took a while not to be so guarded after that experience. But yeah, you get to a point where you're like, you have to let people in. It's not good for you if you don't. So I definitely found that it took a while for me to feel fully recovered from a few of those experiences.
Mm. And yeah, as you said, that's a lot of pressure, particularly with a potential record. What was your relationship to this potential record?
So that was an interesting one. It wasn't that much of a motivator for me, if I'm honest, particularly throughout the process, but I had sort of a love-hate relationship with it. There was definitely an interest of like how crazy would it be to not only climb Everest, which I've always wanted to do, but to be able to say I'm the youngest Australian to have done it. Like there was that kind of cool part to it there, but it's something I didn't think about too much when training or getting ready for the climb, but I also understood it's kind of my ticket there. It's why I'm being sponsored. It's why, I'm able to go and do it. But it's also putting that spotlight on you, which can sometimes be uncomfortable when you are someone that just wants to put your head down and do the work sort of thing. So it was kind of twofold. It was a bit of a motivator, and then also there were times where I was like, should I have waited a few years and not been the youngest Australian? There was some pressure that came with it for sure.
Yeah, there's almost that ebb and flow of like excitement that there's a potential record on the line. And then I suppose when there's moments that you feel quite exhausted or challenged, you kind of question whether you've put yourself in the right position at such a young age.
Yeah, exactly. So it was both of those things. It would be, if you pull that off, that's awesome. But, it's, you sometimes wonder, have I done this process the right way? Should I have waited? Yeah.
So obviously we'll go back to your Everest first attempt. What happened?
So my first attempt on Everest, so I was 17. We'd been living in base camp for a couple of weeks because it takes a bit of time to acclimatise and all of that. And I remember one morning I'd gotten up. I was probably the first up in our base camp. And it was a pretty quiet morning. It was like 6 a.m. And I was heading down to the mess tent in our base camp, and our head Sherpa came along, and he was on the radio, and he just said to me, "Oh, avalanche. And that's pretty normal in base camp. So I was sort of like, I wonder why he's telling me. Like you're not in the way of avalanches, but you can hear them going off in the background around the valley that you're in. And so I didn't think much of it at first. And then it turned out that there was a big serac, basically a massive ice block the size of a house, had dropped and killed 16 Sherpas. And that was my first season on Everest. So, woke up to that news, and that sort of played out throughout the day. So initially we'd heard, we think people might have been in an avalanche. There's a couple of people that might have been hit. And then throughout the day, it just kept progressing, and we could hear it over the radio. There's 4. Now there's 10. It turns out there's 16 people that have been killed. So that was very confronting, and it made it very real. If you didn't already feel like you're on Everest, you now realised how things can go from being literally a normal, calm morning in base camp to catastrophic in a matter of minutes. And, that was my first real exposure to death as well. Those 16 climbers all had to be pulled out of the icefall and, taken back to Kathmandu, which sort of happened right next to our base camp and that sort of thing. So, there was a lot going on for me at that time.
And so what's going through your mind? Because obviously, as we just spoke about, there's an element of you that you're keeping internal because you're like, I don't want to appear weak. And obviously this is a very vulnerable situation that's sort of come into fruition. What's going on in your mind in those moments?
It was really sad, obviously. You get involved with the climbing community, and particularly on Everest, and being around the Sherpa culture. It's such an amazing culture, and you become quite close, particularly going through the hardships that you do in life in the mountains and just being a very tight-knit base camp. So that element that I still sort of kept to myself, though, I was used to being very reserved. So I probably seemed quite calm, but it was devastating for so many reasons. Selfishly, to know that, this has happened when you've done all this work, you're here on Everest, you've invested 3 years of your life into this, and just like that, it's pretty well done. And, to have such a negative experience straight off the bat, that was quite tough. And also then the element of all of these people have just been killed. I think just overall it took a while to process, and it's something that I continue to process when I got home. It's a hard thing to come to terms with.
And when you got home, like what is that process of sort of moving through like a massive disaster like that? And obviously, as you said, there's that element of death that you are new to, but also on the other side of things is you trained for 3 years to get to this point that you weren't even able to give it a try.
Yeah, it took a while, and I think over the years I'd gotten quite good at compartmentalizing. So in hindsight, probably should have actually gone and spoken to someone. But I sort of moved through that process a lot like I had with my parents splitting and that sort of thing, as I threw myself into what I knew, which was my training, lots of pack walking, just, again, time in my own head to sort of come to a decision and also work through everything that happened. And, there was frustration that I'd worked so hard for that opportunity and it was just gone. And then also, what happened to the climbing community. So it took a few months and of just time where I really didn't know what to do from there. Like, you just kind of like, where do I go from here? Because everything was very dependent on how that expedition played out. And so I had a choice to, continue to invest in it or to move on. And but I just took some time. I didn't come to a decision straight away. I just slowly but surely got back into my training and, spent time with family. I'd sort of still weren't close, but I'd reconnected a little bit with, my mum and my sister and all that sort of thing. And it just took some time.
And obviously with the side of your family that I guess were more fearful for something that you're going to attempt, how did this sort of play into their idea?
Was not good for me. They were a bit, see what happens on Everest, which I'm also aware they don't see a lot of the training that I would go through. The fact that I'd been trained by someone in the SAS and had gone through this massive mental process already, I think they'd be horrified if they saw some of the training camps or the trips that I've done and what they were like. So the only real silver lining to that horrible situation was me feeling like I was calm under pressure. I felt like I was able to handle that situation, and it made me realize how good my training had been, because whilst it was terrible, like, this was a worst case scenario situation, and, I felt like I'd performed and did what I needed to do while I was over there. So I had that confidence in myself, if nothing else. From them, they were very concerned, and I think sort of trying to, politely deter me from the idea of going back. And they were like, oh, look, that's done. And, I still had it within me to want to go back. But for them, it was proof of like, this is why we're concerned. Definitely.
Mm-hmm. And so at what point did you decide that you're going to try again?
I'd probably been home for like 4 months and definitely still knew I had that desire there. And I knew I didn't want to necessarily quit on my dream of Everest, but it did seem like there were too many things to stop that from happening. I wouldn't have to pay the full price again going back, but I did need some sponsorship. So I had to secure that again. I would have to, build myself back up again physically through training. There were a few things that would have to align, and then it was very dependent on how the Sherpas felt. Would the climbing season go ahead again? We didn't really know. So that was quite frustrating, but I just decided, you know what, I'm not ready to give up on it yet. And so, about 4 months, a little bit more, 4 or 5 months after that incident happened, I started to go, right, I think I'm going to go back, and began training for that. And then it turned out that, the season the next year was going to go ahead.
Okay, so let's go to attempt 2.
Yes.
What happened this one?
All right, so again, same sort of process. You meet with your climbing team and get into base camp and do all of that. On this particular year, we'd been there a little bit longer than last time, so probably about 3 weeks. but we still hadn't really climbed on the mountain yet. So we'd done a couple of weeks of climatization, and then we'd hiked around the area to just start to get ready for it. And the day that we were going to start climbing on the mountain, I remember getting packed the night before, and then our head Sherpa, we got up at 2 a.m. to get ready to climb through the icefall. And our head Sherpa said to us, we can't go up this morning. There's been a lot of snowfall overnight, and that section is particularly dangerous already. It's where the previous avalanche happened. The Khumbu Icefall is probably the most dangerous section on the mountain. And, he said to us, look, we'll delay it one more day. So we'll have a rest day in base camp, and we'll plan to go up tomorrow to Camp 1. And at about midday that day, the Nepal earthquake hit. So I was in my personal tent in base camp, and I just remember this was like we'd had a team lunch, and then a few of us went back to our tents, and some were still in the mess tent. And I think I was just reading, and then I felt the ground shake, and it took a minute to process what it was, because you're kind of off guard in base camp. Like, it's the one place on Everest that's usually quite safe. So you're kind of just not thinking about anything. And the ground shook, and I remember I then heard this noise outside my tent, and I unzipped it, and I could see this giant wall of like snow coming at us. So basically that earthquake had triggered all of the mountains around base camp to create one massive avalanche. And it's quite a big distance. So just the power of nature to see how quickly that avalanche hit base camp from such a big distance away. It took seconds. So it was full on. The whole area was just so unstable. And I remember once I realized that's picking up speed, it's getting stronger, it's not slowing down, because we initially thought, oh, it's not going to hit us. And it clearly was going to. So we had about 3 seconds. I literally zipped up my tent, jumped to the other side of it, and basically just had to sit there and wait for this thing to hit us, see how big or whatever, and just kind of deal with it from there. But yeah, there's that initial dread of realizing this is going to hit us. And then, yeah, there was about a 30-second period where we were just getting battered by this avalanche. And I thought, we're not going to get out of this. It was getting heavier, and I was starting to get buried in my tent. And I thought, I'm not going to be able to get out of here. And then it just stopped all of a sudden. And it was just really like eerily quiet. And then I went, okay, most of my tent was destroyed and buried, but I was lucky that I was still able to get out of it. The risk is if your zips get buried or you get knocked on impact or something, then you'll get stuck under that avalanche. So I was very, very lucky that I was able to get out of it. But like that day, 20 climbers were killed in base camp. There was a doctor from one of the US teams that we knew that was killed. It was even worse than the year before. It was huge. Base camp was just destroyed, and immediately went into like getting casualties and anyone injured out of there pretty much. So we weren't even thinking about the climb, obviously. It was just, we'll do what we can while we're here sort of thing.
That's full on.
Yep.
So I'm trying to process all of that. So I'm curious. I mean, having an avalanche come at you is frightening. What is going through in your mind, like in those 10 seconds of realizing that an avalanche is coming for you and having to sort of jump to the corner of your tent? Because, obviously, like, is that a moment of you actually considering like this could be it for me?
Yes. And I actually, like, not to be too morbid, but I actually came to a point where I'd accepted that I was going to die in it, because it just looked like there's no way. There's definitely, the feeling was like on the surface, I was very clinical and you feel very helpless. But on the surface, I was like, I know the steps of what I have to do to try and get out of this as best I can. But God, emotionally, there's that moment of dread, realizing this thing is going to hit us. And you feel very helpless. And for me, it was just getting to that moment, particularly we were it felt a lot longer, but we were about 30 seconds into really getting hit by this thing. And I'd pretty much accepted that this was going to be it. Like, it didn't look like it was slowing down. It was really heavy. And I initially got knocked over by it, but luckily the impact didn't hurt me or anything. But yeah, God, emotionally, like massive just adrenaline, where I thought definitely this is it.
So is there anything that, like, was there any like images or certain thoughts that popped up? Because I know, it's quite common for people that are sort of in that life-threatening situation, they can almost describe it as their life flashing before their eyes. Is there anything that kind of popped up for you that you were surprised about?
Not that I was too surprised about, but you definitely have that moment once you've accepted it where you do sort of run through, and it is like that life flash before your eyes sort of thing. But yeah, for me, it was thinking about family that initially pops up. The big one for me was definitely my younger brother, Christian. We've always been quite close. And I think for me, that was always my fear if something did happen to me. I wasn't actually as concerned about myself because I'd chosen to be there. But that was the one thing that sort of made me feel bad was, him not being able to understand what's happened to me if something does. He's very connected to everyone in our family. And, he was quite young at the time as well. So I knew that would be huge on him, was like he wouldn't understand where I've gone, why he can't see me or contact me or anything like that. That was the biggest one for me. I thought a lot about him. Yeah.
And through realizing that, was there a way in which like you kind of changed your behavior in coming home, like because of that sort of realization?
Absolutely. I think it puts things into perspective for you. And I think particularly with the years before with, the divorce and my family not really understanding the path that I was on, it is easy to feel like there's a little bit of resentment there, or, I didn't feel that close to them, or, kind of like they weren't accepting of me and what I was doing. That did definitely make me closer to that side of my family, and put things into perspective for, wanting to spend more time with them and my brother and that sort of thing, because that's kind of what flashed before my eyes was, how good I had it in my life back in Australia and with my family, even if we didn't see things the same way, even if they were concerned, it definitely made me closer to them.
Yeah, it's kind of in those moments that you realize, like, yeah, what's the point of holding on to a lot of the stuff that you hold on to? And is it really that important?
Yeah, definitely.
Yeah, there's beautiful gifts that can come out of situations like this, which is really nice.
Yeah,
so,
definitely.
So you get out of the tent, obviously, and then what happens?
So getting out of the tent, I could see that base camp was pretty much destroyed. And one of the first things that I had seen was a guy being carried in a stretcher. So I think he had lost his eye in that avalanche. So he was critical, bleeding, and they were carrying him to an evacuation point, which was near us, because they've got like 3 helipads in base camp. And yeah, basically the rescue started. I immediately was like, we need to find the rest of our team in case, like me, they're buried, but maybe they can't get out. They haven't got a lot of time. Like, we need to get to everyone and find where they are. And yeah, it was pretty, again, I was just so used to like, okay, we need to do this, 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 and this. But emotionally, it was quite confronting, particularly because there were a couple of people in our team that were just quite hysterical about what had just happened. I don't think they were experienced mountaineers, and neither was I, but like I said, I'd been quite well trained, and I'd had people deliberately try and confront me with things to be ready. And there was a woman near my tent who was on our team, and she had actually gotten caught out in the avalanche. So she was like covered in ice and snow, and she actually had frostbite happening. So I helped her initially, like try and get her fingers warm. But it was pretty full on because her and then another woman were quite hysterical about it. And, we all thought we were going to die. So we're like half trying to deal with the situation, but also, you know, like deal with that as well and sort of make people feel better. But, you know, we knew we weren't out of the woods yet, because my first thought too was we're going to have aftershocks as well. So we're still stuck in a really unstable area and there's nowhere like safe to go. You're literally stuck in the middle of the mountains. So, smaller avalanches were still happening. And basically it was anyone who's not critical or needing evacuation, you at least need to get out of base camp. So like we were quite emotionally drained at that point. It all happened very quickly. And we then had to leave a lot of our gear behind, just get a day pack and just shove whatever you can that you might need in it. And then we've got to hike back down to the nearest village. And so, yeah, that all happened in a very short period of time again. Things went from really quiet and normal to like deadly in a matter of minutes.
And throughout all of this, are you sort of just running on like pure adrenaline?
Literally.
Yeah. So you're not able to sort of like process what's happening. You're kind of just like, I need to make sure everyone is okay and we need to get out of here.
Literally, yeah. It was pure adrenaline, particularly after getting caught in the avalanche and getting out of it. I just straight away went, yeah, we're in a bad position. Let's do whatever we can to, you know, get everyone organised. And like I said, there are a few of them that were like almost paralysed by what had just happened, and we weren't in a good spot. So myself and a few of the other climbers that felt somewhat okay and were running on adrenaline, we're like trying to get everyone's packs organised. All right, let's get down. And we had to hike for about an hour. And sort of during that time, I was starting to process, you know, what had just happened. But then we got to the next village and it was a better position, but even like there were a few aftershocks and I just kept thinking, we're going to die here, because the ground would start shaking again. And we were in this section where we were hiking and there's these massive rocks up above where we are. So these aftershocks are like setting off everything around us. You just felt like nothing was stable around you and nothing was safe. So you always had to be ready to move or go pretty much. Even that night, we stayed in the local Sherpa tea house, but we had to sleep like with our clothes on, boots on, pack outside the door, ready to get out if there was another aftershock, because you could see like the buildings, they really weren't made that stable. So you just like were always on edge while you were in the country pretty much.
Yeah. So were you able to sort of rest and sleep from exhaustion, or were you sort of just on still?
I think I was sort of on still. You try to I did actually for the first night for a little bit, because I think there was sort of that adrenaline dump of like, wow, what just happened? So I did get some sleep, but yeah, then you'd sort of half wake up and go, we're not out of it yet. So it was this interesting mix of adrenaline coming down from that, but then also having to be on alert pretty much. So what happened from there is we had to actually go back up to base camp the next day to retrieve all of the gear. And again, there were more big avalanches that luckily weren't as big as the first one. But there were a few where I'm like, is that going to hit base camp? Or they still looked pretty sizable. Like we were not safe and we just had to get up there, like pack all of our stuff up and get it ready to get out of there, and then hike all the way back down to the airport at Lukla. So once we started hiking a bit further down, it was still unstable, but not as bad down lower. So you could start to feel like, all right, we're coming out of it. And you could process things a little bit more and have time to do that. But, yeah, it was a really full-on situation. And I was sort of wondering, I don't know how or when I can get home. I don't know how, like, the condition of the airport is. And I managed to get home pretty quickly, luckily. But, yeah, it was really full-on.
And when you were there, were you kind of just like, yeah, it's time to go home? Like, I need to go home.
I think I knew straight away. Like with the season before that, there was actually some deliberation as to whether it would still go ahead, because it created a lot of political issues, but it wasn't necessarily a given that the season wouldn't go ahead. So we spent, in 2014, the season before this one, we spent probably a couple of weeks over in Nepal going, we might still climb, so don't like mentally check out of it yet. Whereas this one, I knew straight away, I'm like, yeah, this is huge, particularly because like base camp was completely destroyed, but I was then getting satellite reports back home, from back home, where they were saying they were updating me on the bigger situation in Kathmandu because we were quite isolated. We didn't really know what this thing had done. And then we were getting reports that it was like 10,000 people had been killed in the country. And we were like, yeah, this is finished. And we're not even thinking about the climb anymore. So, yeah, I didn't even consider that we would be climbing. We just kind of were like, all right, we'll help in any way we can while we're over here. But again, you just feel really helpless, particularly with the magnitude of it. Like, yeah, you do little things that you can help with evacuations and that sort of thing. But other than that, you do feel quite helpless. And, you know, the first time I visited Nepal, I was 10. And for me, it's as much a part of my history as Australia is in a lot of ways. It was kind of a second home to me. So seeing it like that was pretty tough.
Yeah, so you're back in that space where Nepal has like another like really big accident that affects the entire nation. And you're also unable to attempt your goal again. So when you get home, like what does it look like after going through like two pretty massive experiences for you in the last 2 years, you know, on top of all the pressure from obviously sponsors and expectations? Like how does that kind of unfold when you go back to more of, I guess, the quiet space of home?
It was quite difficult because I felt like I was capable of doing it, but pretty much everyone sort of involved, I think, thought, oh, yeah, this is never going to happen, or had like written it off now and gone, you know, there's too many issues with it, that sort of thing. So I knew it would be really frustrating for me to not get to have a chance at it when I felt like I just think I'm capable of it and I'd like the opportunity to prove it. So, yeah, you know, we had sponsors drop off and that sort of thing, which was pretty much expected. And it looked like this thing was pretty well done. And same thing, it gave me the chance to reconnect with family again when I got home, and that was really helpful for me. But also I got back into my training purely for my own mental state, just to get back into, you know, I knew that had helped me a lot the last time, so I did that again. But, you know, it was really challenging. I'd made a lot of sacrifices because I believed it would happen, and then this happened. So it actually threw my whole future and a lot of what I'd worked for into question now, and I felt pretty directionless, which was hard. And same sort of thing, just decided to sit on it for the next few months and see what happens going forward. But I, at that point, wasn't even thinking I'd return. I just thought there's so many things going on in that country that, you know, it might be something that I do in 10 years. I thought, you know, someday I'd like to do it, but I have a feeling it's not going to be anytime soon. So I kind of expected that I'd have to pivot and take a completely different path in life, and I didn't know what that was going to be at the time.
Mm-hmm. Because I know in your book you spoke about even experiencing some form of depression in getting back. Was that kind of from that? Do you think there was like an element of post-traumatic stress in that, or is that sort of from the feeling of directionless? Like where do you think that stemmed from?
I think there probably was some post-traumatic stress, which I didn't really I didn't really give that the credit that it probably needed at the time, you know, because you just expect yourself to be really capable when you're training to be a high altitude mountaineer. It's like, yep, it's another obstacle, just handle it sort of thing. But yeah, I think I was quite on edge after that. Which took me a few years to realize. Like, I look back at it now and I wasn't sleeping very well. Like, my patterns were just all over the place. And I didn't really give myself the time to come down from that, and probably compartmentalized it a little bit too much. And yeah, I definitely felt that. And then I think a little bit later adding the directionlessness to it just compounded that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, because I know personally, a couple of years ago, I lived in Tunisia in North Africa, and I experienced in the first week of moving there an attempted kidnapping. And it wasn't until about a year later that I moved back to Australia that I realized that I had like post-traumatic stress. And I find it fascinating with strong-willed people in like experiencing things like this and genuinely not realizing, because you're so used to that warrior energy and getting through everything, how much it's actually affecting you underneath.
That's very true. And I think often the things that can be your strongest qualities can actually work against you at a certain point. And I experienced that. A lot of being a really good, high altitude expedition mountaineer is you've got to be really stubborn. You've got to push on when most people would quit. So a lot of these things that were like a great quality over there in that context, particularly when you're handling situations like that, it's then like, how do you recognize, later on? And I look back now and think I had no ability to recognize what was going on with me emotionally and how that was affecting me or anything like that. And I just used the same thing. I'm like, well, I'll just push through it. Like, that's all I knew. So yeah, it's funny. I continued that for a while. And I think I only really got to a breaking point that I had to address like years later. So I carried on for a while in that mindset of just pack it away, handle it, and push forward. But yeah, it was definitely starting to affect me after those two incidents. It just put me on edge quite a lot. Yeah.
Yeah, it's an incredibly fascinating hindsight is incredibly fascinating in that sense, because when you get to the point that you're able to recognize what you've been going through, it kind of all makes sense and becomes really clear.
Yeah, definitely.
But yeah, I certainly think in terms of mental toughness, it is that challenge of knowing where the line is on, okay, like I'm a really mentally tough person and I'm capable of achieving any form of goal that I set myself to, and understanding that there is also a line that's actually not good for you and you don't need to, warrior yourself through absolutely everything.
Absolutely. I think that's a huge point. And I definitely feel that now, particularly in the last couple of years, because I did previously have that mindset. But yeah, it's learning how to switch it on when it's important, and then understanding that there's certain environments where that is going to hurt you more than help you is really, really important.
Mm-hmm. And I certainly would love to touch on this with you towards the end of this podcast. I'd love to go to Everest attempt 3 first. So you make the decision that you're going to go and attempt it again. Talk me through that.
Yeah, so I knew I would be returning. Well, to be honest, there was a lot of uncertainty leading up to this third one, pretty much right up until it happened. And I think this sort of compounds that PTSD in a way as well, is where literally everything in your life is so uncertain. There's no environment. My home life at the time wasn't particularly stable either. So there was a lot of like moving parts in my life where I just had to be solid within myself and go, all right, just confront each situation the best way that you can. And I started training with the intention of returning to the mountain 6 months out, and then did a really intensive final 3 months leading up to it. But, until like probably the week before, I was like, this thing may happen, it may not happen. And it turned out that the climbing season was going ahead. And so, yeah, flew over to Kathmandu and third attempt. So I remember getting into base camp, and actually the head Sherpa sort of sat us all down and was like, look, you might have some issues when you hear avalanches. You might, like, you guys are now sort of wired to this place, and you've had these 2 massive incidents happen. And funny thing is, for decades before that, there was nothing. So, we really got hit with some of the tougher seasons. And you definitely had that sense when you were over there. Like, everyone in the country was sort of like that. It was just a really interesting time. Everyone was still trying to recover from what had happened. But I actually remember one of the Sherpas saying to me, he was like, we want to have a really positive climbing season on Everest, because for a lot of people that's always been, it's a dream. It is a really positive thing. It's something that's inspired them. And there are times when it turns deadly, and we'd experienced a lot of that. So I think everyone was like, we want this to just be a really positive year, hopefully, for the climbing season. And it was definitely a risk going back. But yeah, we got into base camp and the Sherpas were like, look, don't stress, but you may have some issues when you hear avalanches and things like that. Just remember it is normal for this area. It's not necessarily catastrophic. It's just, I think there are a few people quite on edge or a bit nervous, and we were all a bit skeptical to see if the season would actually start. For me, it was like, when I've got my boots on and I'm going up through the icefall, I'll believe it. But yeah, it went ahead. It started. So we actually got to start climbing, and that was very surreal because I'd spent a lot of time at base camp looking up at the route on Everest, wishing we could go up and climb it, and looking at the icefall that's literally right there. And now I was actually climbing up into it. So yeah, we got to do our first ever day on Everest. Was like, we just climbed like 6 hours up through that icefall. And that was kind of, I was pinching myself like I'm actually climbing on Everest right now. So another sort of, silver lining, I guess, to the previous couple of seasons was once I was actually on the mountain, I was so grateful. And I thought, don't waste an opportunity here, because it's a big deal to actually be getting to climb right now. I think that sort of helped me, even through some of my tougher days, go, you've wanted this more than anything and it's in front of you. So I was really grateful for the opportunity, which I think helped me climb as well.
Yeah. Was there like a form of like elation almost, like mixed with like disbelief?
Yes.
Kind of? Yeah.
Absolute elation and disbelief. Like this was actually the first rotation, because I was used to, a lot of acclimatization, and we're going to do a hike near the mountain and we're going to do this. We'd never actually gone, this is rotation 1 on an Everest expedition. It's official. And I got to actually do that. So staying at Camp 1 and actually getting on top of the icefall, which is where Camp 1 is, and actually being there and then getting to look down the valley that you've come up from, like that to me was a really good sign. And just elation that like, oh, we're actually on Everest right now. There was a lot of disbelief. A few months earlier, I thought, oh, this may never happen. Maybe I'll return in 10 years. And then I got to be there. So I was very grateful.
And does Everest feel like home to you?
It actually does. It does in a lot of ways. I remember I saw it for the first time when I was 10, and I got to trek to Everest Base Camp. But that whole Everest region, there's a sense of home, and probably for me a sense of belonging on Everest that I didn't have in a lot of other areas of my life. For me it's actually kind of a grounding point in a lot of ways, and I actually felt more at home there than I did at my home at the time. So that helped me a lot as well. Even though I was going through some pretty tough climbing days, I was in my element, and this place did have a sense of home for me. So I didn't really have too much homesickness or anything like that because of that reason. Yeah.
Yeah, I know that I did some trekking in Nepal a few years ago. And I remember getting up I did the Annapurna circuit, and I remember getting up every morning and just looking out to the mountains and just feeling that deep sense of connection that it's just incredibly powerful, and it's really hard to explain unless you've sort of been in the mountains. And
it is. And I know that feeling that you're describing, and it's the same for me whenever I get back to Nepal and I'm actually in the mountains. It's the same thing. And I think there's been a few people and a few Australians I know that have been over there and just went, I can't even describe that feeling, but there is a sense of belonging and connection over there that I haven't experienced in any other area of my life.
Yeah. Do you feel like, because I certainly do, like a sense of nostalgia, like will just pop up on you and you'll just kind of like you'll feel that sort of like pull towards going back there?
Absolutely. Yeah. So I'm definitely keen to get back there for that reason. I always have that sort of feeling pop up here and there. Yeah.
Mm. So on your third attempt, is there any part of you that is thinking, okay, maybe the universe is saying to me, not a good idea?
Yes. And I thought, I definitely did. I was like, it's hard not to think that when you've had 2 seasons back to back like that. I'm like, maybe there's a particular, time frame that Everest doesn't want to be climbed. Maybe it's saying no. I just decided to give it one more crack, but I thought, if this signals no as well, then maybe it wasn't meant to happen, or meant to happen at this time or whatever. So I don't think I would have been surprised if I'd got that signal the third time. But it was weird. Everything, we almost were like, it's suspicious that it's going really well. Like everything literally came together how we thought it would the first time I went to climb Everest. So, weather was great. There were just no issues. It was peaceful in a lot of ways. It was how I thought an Everest expedition would go.
Mm-hmm. And going there for a third time with everything that had happened, you obviously got to a point where you had to accept that this genuinely could be a life and death situation.
Definitely. And that's something, particularly in the final few weeks leading up to it, I thought through a lot in my own head. I didn't want to, for sponsorship reasons, for any other reasons, I didn't want to go back for the wrong reasons. I was like, I also knew if there's a percentage of doubt where, I'm not training at 100%, I'm not giving it 100%, then I shouldn't go, because what if the opportunity does open up, but then now I haven't done the preparation, or I'm not going to be a good team member or ready to go. So it was a big decision to go back. And I did think that through. I thought, what if there are more earthquakes? We don't know. We didn't know the first time. What if there's another avalanche? What if the place is still really unstable from what's happened the last 2 years? That was very confronting, particularly as I was starting to climb up into the icefall. And I thought, this is the exact section where all those people were killed a couple of years earlier, and there's nothing to stop that from happening to me. So it's a very real feeling of fear. I decided this was worth it enough for me to walk into that and confront it.
And I read in your book that you wrote actually a letter sort of accepting that, if something were to happen on the mountain and happen to you, that you were okay with that.
Yeah, so I went over there having pre-accepted that something was possibly going to go wrong, probably more than I ever had, and wanted to make sure everything was in order when I did. And I think part of that too is just knowing you've got that in place, but also then when I get over there, I can give it 100% and be okay with that decision to do that. So there are a couple of things actually I left a letter at home that I gave to someone I trusted and said, if something does happen, this has got everything you need. There was also that letter, if I had died on Everest, was going to be released as the ending of the book. So that still would have come out, and it would have had my own words, as the final pages. But then also summit push, when we'd spent a few weeks climbing there and we were about to go up to the very top and have a real attempt at this thing, I messaged my dad through the satellite phone, and I just said, look, whatever happens over this next week, just know that I really wanted to be here and doing this, so I'm okay with however this plays out. And that was that acceptance of I think I had a moment of realization after having done some climbing up on the mountain, having been through the icefall, that it's going to be even more unpredictable up higher, and it's so easy for things to go wrong, particularly near the summit. So I wanted him to know that, and had to prepare people back home for the fact that, the very nature of being up there, you're going to push that limit very close to the line and you might go over. So I wanted to know that I could do that, and there was nothing holding me back from that.
Is there something liberating about that? Just being completely certain in what you're doing?
That's a very good way to put it. I would say it was very liberating because, I just think I felt for my own sake too. Now looking back at it, at the time, I think I thought I want my family to be as well equipped as possible to handle, media that comes after it, and they can say, look, this is what Alyssa said in her own words, like, because I knew they'd try and spin it as she didn't know what she was doing. She, had no idea what Everest was going to be like, wasn't prepared for it, which wasn't the case. And I still felt bad for what they were potentially going to go through if something happened to me. But I realize now too, it was also for me personally, because I needed to be fully where I was and be willing to push that limit. You couldn't mentally be back in base camp or be back home or have any part of you that wasn't 100% ready to go. So I think that was part of it as well, as, just knowing that everything was sorted and now you are liberated. You can give everything to this and push this as far as you want to go. So it kind of gave me that sense of freedom to do that.
Mm-hmm. And where did that take you?
So over the next week, we began the summit push, and again was like pinching myself that I was actually on the summit push of Everest. And at this point, I'd been living there for over 2 months or close to 2 months. And it was just time to go. So over the next 5 days, we climbed Everest. We went up to Camp 3, Camp 4, and I remember, being at the final camp, and then the next morning reached the summit first thing early in the morning. And like, I actually feel like I'm back there, like the goosebumps I get when I think about making literally those final few steps onto the summit. I don't think there's anything that describes that feeling, particularly after the first 2 attempts. I couldn't believe that it happened.
And what did you say anything out loud? Like, were you like, what was going on in that moment?
So much, but it's surprisingly peaceful. I think, like, you spend the night climbing, particularly on summit night, and you're ready for a mental fight. Like, this is going to be the toughest day. You're going to be exhausted. There's a lot of adrenaline and nerves of, like, if anything goes wrong up here, we're a long way from any sort of rescue. Like, you're really in it at that point. But getting onto the summit, there was a feeling of like validation that I was right to back myself and I was right to believe in myself. And it was actually another one of those, like, your life flashes before your eyes sort of moment where my brain actually went right back to like Kokoda and, people telling me I wouldn't be capable of that. And, me going, no, I'm going to give it a go. And you just kind of, look back on everything that you've done and then realize where it's now led you. But it almost feels like there's no such thing as time up there. You just are where you are. It's the most peaceful feeling I've actually felt once you get onto the summit. You can literally just hear your oxygen tank humming, but it's surprisingly calm up there.
And you took a photo of your brother Christian up there?
I did. I had one with me. So I took that with me during the climb. And, it was pretty cool to have that with me as well. And, that's pretty much the only thing I had. I had that and then this like small Australia flag, particularly because I was now the youngest Australian to do it. So I took that up there with me as well.
And what were you thinking? Because obviously that was really important to you. Was there like anything that was going through your mind in relation to Christian that you were like wanting to maybe tell him when you got home?
Yeah, I mainly wanted to tell him that, almost that he'd been up there, like he was with me. And I did have that sense when I was up there. So I wanted to be able to show him that, hey, I got to the top of the mountain and you were there. I knew, particularly at his age at the time, he would think that was the coolest thing ever.
It is pretty cool.
Yeah. I knew he'd love that. But just having that with me was really special, particularly because like growing up and as I started to get into the more challenging mountains, and I remember saying to my dad once, I actually feel bad that I'm risking my life when, I've got the health that he doesn't have and I can do things that he can't necessarily do. And he said to me, well, no, that's actually a good reason why you do it. He doesn't have the opportunity to go and push the limit like you do and to really go out there and do all the things he might want to do with his life because of some of his disabilities. So, you owe it to people like him to make use of what you've got sort of thing. But, you know, he and I have always been very close, Christian and I, and even when I was very young, that was always the hardest for me, was being away from him. So, yeah, it was kind of cool to have him with me on the mountain.
Mm. And so you spend 20 minutes up there, is it?
Correct. Yep. So 20 minutes on the summit.
Time both stop and go very quickly up there in that time?
Yeah, it's a very weird sort of feeling. You're like, yeah, it's almost like time stands still, but then you have to sort of jump back into reality of like, we can only be up here for so long. So it's why it's great to have a Sherpa climbing partner, because they're like, yeah, we got to get back down while you're up there enjoying your moment on the summit. But you have that moment of just taking it all in. And I wanted to be very particular about that. I at least wanted a bit of time to go, I did it, and to have that moment with myself, then get photos and everything. And then I was like, I'll let people know when I can. But yeah, then you've got to get back down, and there's that very real feeling then of, you know, how long have we been up here, and having to make sure that we're not, pushing too far past that line, because you can only be up in that final section really for 24 hours before you have to get back down.
And when you start going back down, do you still feel that strong conviction of, because obviously in going back down, not a lot of people know, it's like that's almost the most dangerous, because that's when people are really exhausted and they kind of like let their guard down. Do you have any moment where you're like, I'm still willing to die for this? Or is there an element of like, now that I've done this, like I'd just like to get back down the mountain now?
Yeah, I reckon it is that. It's now that I've done it, you don't have the same conviction, and it's crazy how quickly it changes. Once I started the descent, literally almost straight away, you're aware of how exhausted you actually are. You're not aware of it when you're on the way up and it's like, this is the day and it's the summit day. You're running on adrenaline. On the way down, it's like that literally just goes. And now you're like, I'm exhausted. I don't know if I can get back down. You're literally just focusing on your next few steps. But it is the most dangerous section. And any of the deaths that I've seen were on the way back down. So I've always had this real, like, you go into survival mode, and I had this real moment of be really focused. Like, I had that conversation with myself, be really particular right now. And I actually legitimately pushed out that I just summited, that I was the youngest Australian to do it. I literally wouldn't allow myself to think through all of that. I was like, process it later, because, you know, people, it's so easy to make stupid mistakes where you don't clip in your safety correctly, and that's the time that it will happen. So I was actually quite surprised how strong I felt on summit day. You are aware how exhausted you are, but, you know, cognitively I was still quite aware. It's so easy for that to go as well. But I just knew, do not screw up the little things, and I was like really particular about that.
And so at what point did you have space to kind of start processing everything that had just happened?
I think initially, once I got back to Camp 4, I had a little moment of that where we got back to camp and we had about an hour there before we then had to pack everything up and start to move down. So I had a moment of just absolute disbelief where I was literally on the other side of this thing now. And I just couldn't believe that. It's almost like this imaginary line that I almost couldn't wait to get past to see what life after Everest would be like. And I was just sitting there in Camp 4 like, it's done. We did it. Yeah. And then it popped into my mind where I was like, I'm the youngest Australian to climb Mount Everest. And it was only then that like it dawned on me that I'd done that. So yeah, I was just processing all of that. And I initially tried to get contact back home, but it was hard up there. I wasn't able to get through. And then I was back to sort of survival mode, exhaustion, that sort of thing, until I didn't really start to process it again until I got back to Camp 2, once we got back halfway down the mountain. And then yet again, I was able to process it a bit more and like celebrate it internally. And I actually managed to satellite phone home. But also I managed to get onto my dad, who was on the Kokoda Track at the time. leading a group. So we were like satellite phone to satellite phone trying to reach each other. He had no idea that I'd done it yet. And this was like the one person that was with me through this process. And news had reached back home. And I was kind of still in my Everest bubble where I didn't know what was going on outside of me. And I managed to get through to him in a satellite phone and finally was able to say I did it. And we were just both like in disbelief, like, this thing is done. Can't believe you actually did it. So, yeah, it was just huge. But that was a really confronting end of that day as well still, because I had, you know, the joy and elation of like, I did this, but there were a couple of quite confronting deaths as well. One from another Australian that happened the same day that I summited. So the realities of the place were still there pretty much until we got back down to Camp 2. You don't feel like you're kind of safe until you get there.
So you knew some of the people that you witnessed? Yeah.
One that was definitely one that's played on my mind a lot over the years is there was an Australian woman who we weren't close personally, but she was on that same team. And I remember passing her as we were leaving Camp 4. So she had her husband, and then 2 Sherpas were with them, and then we had our team. And, you know, we walked past them and she looked really exhausted. And we remember saying, like, our team was like, oh, you know, do you need anything? Do you need any help or anything like that? And they were like, oh, no, we're good. And she's just really tired, but we're all kind of like that up there. And it wasn't until we got back to base camp a couple days later that I'd found out she died literally a couple of hours after we saw them. And that one was really confronting for me because there were times where I've often thought, should we have done more? I could see how exhausted she was, and I sort of wondered, has she got cerebral edema, which is a form of altitude sickness? It's probably the most lethal. I could just sort of see in her eyes it looked like she did, and we were quite concerned. So, like, we stopped and we're like, oh, do you need anything? And they were adamant, like, oh, no, we're almost down, and seemed okay. So that one definitely weighed on me when I got home because she was an Australian woman, and particularly to see the media that came out after it, I think was very real for me because it could have been me in that position. But, yeah, there's often times over the years where I'm like, oh, should we have given her more oxygen or but, you know, she'd been up in the death zone for over 31 hours, which is way too long. So I don't think she would have survived. But, yeah, it's very confronting and very real when you're hanging out with these people in camps and you pass them and, hey, how are you? And then we found out she didn't even make it to the next camp. That was it. So, yeah, that those are the ones that stick with you more than some of the climbers that you know are going to be up there from previous expeditions, but it's something that's always confronting.
So in coming back to Australia, you've obviously experienced that, which in itself is very full on. And you're also sort of coming into, I assume, your own media with being the youngest Australian to summit Everest. What is that experience like, finally getting to that point that you've been working towards for years now?
Yeah, it was, I remember getting to base camp and I was really grateful for this. Like, you're still in that bubble a little bit because I hadn't yet had contact really with the outside world. And it gave me that time to appreciate my own accomplishment before that reaction sort of came in. So, yeah, I had a 30-minute walk back to my camp once I got to the base of the icefall, and all of that pressure just like straight away lifted off my shoulders. So I've never been so exhausted and elated than when I got back to my tent. Like it's like in literally one moment I'd processed everything that I'd been through over the last few years all in one hit, from the summit to the 2 attempts and even all of the stuff in my personal life. Like, it just felt like everything compounded, and I was able to let that go as soon as I got back to base camp. But then, yeah, I turned on my phone and it just, both the satellite phone and my normal phone, and it was just going crazy. A level of reaction I honestly didn't expect from like the general public, but because there was that youngest Australian record there, yeah, it was exciting. Like, it's definitely, you feel good. You're like, oh, there's all these people sort of invested in what I'm doing and what I've just achieved, which is cool. But that was definitely a struggle for me to manage when I got home. I think I was still in real time very much trying to process everything that I'd been through. And then you're doing that while you're also trying to like sum it up for other people and explain the experience and that sort of thing. So yeah, it was a lot to take on that I didn't necessarily expect at first. But I do remember getting a message from my mum in base camp, which was cool. Like, they were very excited that I'd done it and grateful that I was back down. So yeah.
And like, I mean, obviously it's a massive build up. Did it feel how you thought it would feel to like be a record holder of like youngest Australian to summit Everest? Is it what you expected it to be?
It actually is, which is quite weird because, yeah, I think there's a part of you that does think surely nothing actually lives up to a dream. But that moment did, and I don't know whether it was because a lot of my preparation was so realistic or whatever, but standing on the summit was a dreamlike moment. Like, I felt like I was living a movie pretty much. But, yeah, I was like, because it's something I kept pushing out of my mind, I didn't want that to be the motivation for the climb. But it did end up being the thing that kind of defined it. But I felt expectation that came with that as well. But yeah, it did feel how I imagined it would.
And so when you come back to Australia, you obviously got a lot of media around you. Did you find a lot of people asking what's next?
Absolutely. I think it was the number one question. And I was like, I've literally just landed in Australia. I did feel like I had to answer that. And I just went, God, I don't even know. And for me, this was a very abrupt end to a very long process. So you don't even know where to start looking at what's next. But yeah, that was the number one question I'd get. I was like, hang on, I've just summited Everest. Yeah, heaps of people were asking me that.
Yeah, I find it fascinating because I did watch a few of your interviews, and it's amazing how quickly people move forward.
They do. They're like, great, because they haven't been through the emotions of this experience. They're looking at it from the outside. They're like, awesome, right, next. And where I think everyone involved, including my family, was just like, oh, thank God it's done.
And through that, did you feel like you had additional pressure of like, oh, like I need to have something in the mix of moving forward?
Yeah, I actually think this is a major mistake that I probably made is I'd come to a point where I'd almost started to define myself by that next thing and having that next thing on, and it's got to be big and it's got to be, whereas in hindsight, I probably should have given myself some time and been a bit more deliberate about like what really speaks to me and what I want to do next, because everything will sort of fit from there. I definitely felt that expectation to always like, what's the next big thing going to be? Yeah, definitely. And I made the mistake of identifying with that too much. Yeah.
And so at what point did you notice, oh, hang on, like I'm over-identifying with this. I need to kind of recenter myself and reconnect with myself?
Look, it's been a real process. Like, I sort of realized that probably within the next year to 18 months after I'd done that summit, where, yeah, I'm like, why am I stressing about that? And realized it and sort of had to go back to, well, there was a very specific motivation and feeling of why I wanted to pursue Everest, and you can't just replicate that by going, okay, I'm going to go and do that peak, or I'm going to, there was so much that went into it that, yeah, I realized I needed to sort of get back to myself and learn to define myself outside of that as well. Because, and it's taken a few years, like even up until sort of within the last year, have I only started to feel like I'm more than that. It's been a real process, but yeah, I think it's important after something like that. But yeah, it's been a real process.
Because we were actually laughing before we started recording about the fact that you actually went, not many people know, but you went and summited Everest from the other side.
I did.
it's hard to actually find anywhere that you did that.
Yeah, it's so interesting because it shows that what was of interest was the youngest Australian thing, and there was this particular narrative and people had followed the two, attempts and then the third one. So there's all this build up. But yeah, I kind of quietly went to the north side of the mountain, and that came together kind of because I guess I'd proved myself before, and being sponsored by Mountain Designs allowed me to go back. Like, I never thought I'd ever be in the position to go back to the mountain. But yeah, that in a way, I think I was probably looking for that connectedness with myself again, which is why I did it really quietly. Is there wasn't the record, there wasn't the same interest, but I'm still someone that does like to do what I do and pursue that thing. I'd been in adventure all my life prior to Everest, and yeah, there was something about doing that trip, I think, that was going to help me connect with myself again and this thing that I love to do. But yeah, I certainly didn't have a long-term plan set in stone of what was going to happen after that.
Yeah, so when you return from doing now 2 summits on Everest, and obviously that second successful summit being almost like a transition between being slightly motivated. Obviously, it wasn't your dominant motivation of being a record holder, but it was, as you said, why you got the sponsors and the media attention and all of that. It's how it sort of came into happening. Like, what does your life look like after that? Because, you hear of things like, people that went to the moon, and it's like you go to the moon and then you come back at such a young age. And it's like, how do you set goals? Like, if you're setting goals bigger, like, how do you manage that?
Well, yeah, to be really honest, it was quite a messy process, and it was something that I didn't expect. I found coming home from my second summit of Everest and the next sort of few years after that leading up to now were tougher than anything I'd ever been through, for several reasons. I think, I look at it now, and that second Everest summit in 2018, I was going through a transition period and sort of trying to find, okay, what's an avenue to the next part of my life? Is it going to be, I'm always going to be that high altitude mountaineer and that's what I'm meant to do? Or, is that phase of my life done and I'm going to do this and maybe then go in another direction? So it's interesting. I wanted to do this climb, but it was very much a period of trying to work out, who am I going to be next and what's the avenue to do that? And in returning from that expedition, I had clarity on that. As much as I love, certain expeditions and climbing, I'm not forever going to be defined by that, and it's not going to be my whole life going forward. So that was good. I think that gave me a lot of clarity around that. But yeah, it was a really tough process. I think I often would consider like setting a goal, but then I didn't get that same feeling. And I was like, I'm going to take a step back and not set a goal and not try and answer what's next for a while, because I need a bit more of a solid foundation before I move forward again. It was a really tough period.
So throughout that, like, what did you start doing with this time? Because obviously, like, as you said, you're very analytical, you're very methodical, you're always working towards something. What does life look like when you're not doing that?
Well, I pretty much was forced to go back to square one, because my life had really come full circle, but also I hadn't really addressed, I was still having a lot of issues with sleep. Like, I had no routine. I wasn't particularly healthy. And I think I realized, like, I'm trying to push forward when I haven't dealt with all this stuff back here. So I came to a real point where I was like, if you don't deal with this, you'll never really get to move forward. So don't worry about setting big goals or anything like that. It became clear that I needed to be, good with who I am right now and with where I'm at, and that'll then lead to somewhere, and kind of just have faith that it will. Like, don't worry about the big picture right now. I had to get my sleep in order. Like, I was diagnosed with chronic fatigue, which, like, I would sleep for, an 8-hour night and do a couple things in the morning, and then I'd be tired, like I didn't get any sleep again. And that was really frustrating because as someone who's always had an outlet of like physical training, I didn't really know what to do with myself. So the first thing for me was getting the basics, like trying to get my sleep in order and my health. Finally, I had a friend who could kind of see through it. Like I was good at being quite functional. Like I knew how to sort of pack that back there and be functional on a daily basis. And I had a friend who a couple of years ago was like, I don't think you're okay. Like he'd been through something similar, and he kind of called me on it. Was like, I'm fine. See, I work and I do all this stuff. He's like, nah. He's like, I can see it. So yeah, having him was helpful because he pointed it out, and I was like, yeah, I've got a lot of things I need to work through. So I did start going to see someone and start talking to someone about everything that I'd been through over the last 10 years and just starting to, process that a bit more in my own time. And from there, I then was like, I'm really goal-oriented naturally, so it's been hard to not do that, but trying a lot of different things so that, I can, just get a sense of what might be next without latching onto a big goal necessarily. So that's been really challenging, like holding myself back, going just like try and see what you like outside of climbing, and then we'll worry about that later. Yeah.
Because it definitely makes sense. Because, as we spoke about at the start of the podcast, you sort of said, there was a slight, there was instability at home, and you kind of found that sense of control through goal setting and the process of meeting your goals. When you strip that back and take that away, it only makes sense that everything's going to pop up for you.
It is. And I had no comprehension of that. And it was interesting when I'd gotten back to my tent after Everest in 2016, and I had that moment of just like, oh my God, it's all done. I remember thinking, I wonder what the next few years is going to be like and what that's going to teach me, because if anything, that's now the unknown. For me, it's kind of scary, but you're right. It was literally, I don't think I understood how much I'd used, like adventure, ironically, had become my stability. It was predictable. I knew this expedition cycle. It was the only thing in my life that I could control and that I knew. And then it was gone. And so it forced me to address a lot of things in my personal life that maybe I wasn't happy with, or, and it's funny, I have people around me now who are very study this sort of stuff, and they're very scientific, and they talk about how important it is for kids to have stability. And so I realize now, having that in my life now is important, and sort of just reconfiguring things so that, that sense of stability and control I now get to have in my life, even if I'm not climbing. But it took a massive sort of drop off to go, all right, things really aren't working anymore because there's been a massive change. And just working out how do you readjust after that has been the biggest challenge.
And what is your relationship with climbing now? Do you need to, because as you said, you sort of describe yourself as someone that compartmentalizes. Are you have you packed that away for a bit, or are you just sort of developing a relationship with it that maybe isn't so that comes with so much pressure?
Yeah, I think the second one. There was a period of time, particularly over the last couple of years, where I had to fully pack it away. I didn't want to have it in my mind at all. And I just went, if it comes back up, it sort of comes back up. But the connection with it became not healthy. It became a way of not dealing with other things in my life. And it was almost a coping thing, like this is what I know, so I'll go back to it. But I actually got to a point when I realized that I was like, I don't want that to be the motivation for it. If I don't genuinely love and want to go and do this thing, I'd rather leave it where it is and move on, because it was an awesome part of my life, but I don't want to do it for the sake of doing it. I packed it away, but I think now, I'm at the point now where I am considering returning to certain climbs that I'm really excited about and motivated to do over the next few years. But I decided I'm only going to return to it if there's a much healthier connection to it, and it's not something that has this massive negative impact on the rest of my life, and it's not my identity. It's now something that I get to go and do. So I've just started to get back to that place in the last few months, and will likely, the sort of 2 or 3 climbs that I would love to do, and I'll go and do them, but certainly not defined by it anymore.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, just that ability to sort of be back in that space. But as you sort of said with your experience with Nepal, like just being able to connect with the beauty of the mountains and the opportunity that you get to climb such a beautiful thing and be in that space and just be really present in that moment versus any of that external stuff that probably came with the setting the record.
Absolutely. And it's interesting how just those few things like changes the dynamic that you have on an expedition so drastically. It's almost a different experience in a lot of ways. Like that period of my life, Everest 2016, there'll be nothing like that again because of all of the factors that were involved. And so now when I go back, it'll be, a different experience, but in a good way. Like I'll now go back for that connectedness that I feel to Nepal, my history there. But then, getting to do a certain climb that inspires me, I think it'll be very different now.
And I think a lot of high performers, many of them believe that if they remove that sort of like negative driving motivation, that they're not going to perform as well, that they're not going to be as driven as well.
Explained what was going on in my head. I think there was a complete fear of like, I've often used a lot of negatives and turned that into a positive, and it's actually driven me to perform. And so I genuinely was like, am I not going to perform as well if I am healthy? That sounds ridiculous. But when it has pushed you and you've often used sort of negative parts of your life or something you're not happy with to help you in that space, that's quite confronting because you go, am I going to be as good if I'm not that person anymore? And it's only sort of recently that I've gotten past that and gone, no, I can bring more to the table and be a better version of myself at it. And if I was only doing it for negative things and that was pushing me, it's not a bad thing to lose that. And then maybe it's not what I'm meant to be doing. So,
well, I think that's what happens in these situations is that if you're driven by that negative drive, everyone always meets a point where they get adrenal fatigue, chronic fatigue, they get burnout. There's always that point. And it will always happen. People, a lot of people that aren't at that point yet are like, no way, like this is what gets me going. And
that was me. Yep. 100%. Yeah, you describe it so well. That was me a couple of years ago. No, I can go like this forever and, it just kind of sustains itself, but it doesn't. And you're right, you will burn out. And you get to a point where, that's sort of where I got to, was like, I took a step back, and you just have to have faith that if this is the right thing for me, then me being, healthier and having a more positive motivation, then whatever's right for me in that space will come into my life and it'll be a better fit anyway. But there was that initial fear of like, I have often used those things to drive me. So what happens if they're not there anymore? Yet again, it's just that unknown that you have to face.
And like you're saying, with that sense of identity, so many people do things to be someone. And, I love looking at it the way of like be who you are and then do things from there. And it's such a more healthy and rewarding space to do things from.
It so is. And it's a lot more sustainable across the long term. I think it's just a far better way to do things. From that point of view. And so that's definitely what I've worked on over the last few years in sort of rebuilding myself, was that idea that, imagine if it comes from a better place and, it doesn't have to come from a negative space.
Mm-hmm. And so would your advice be to people in a similar situation to you, no matter at what level, is it to probably check in more with yourself and what your motivators are?
I think so, definitely. And if, it sort of requires it to come from a negative place, readjust and maybe check in with why you are doing it. And I think like there's times in life where you are pushed into a certain situation or where it does feel like your back is against the wall, or maybe something negative is happening that's just so far outside of your control. I think it is the skill set and the mindset of anyone who's high level at something to use that to your advantage. But make sure that doesn't come from you. It's not, I'm looking for something negative to drive me. I think the problem is when that becomes a habit, you're just inviting more negative things into your life. So, I think there's times where you can go, look, I haven't got control over this situation, or I'm going to leverage it and turn it into something positive. But I then had to get to a point where I had to check in with myself and go, imagine if it came from a better place or my motivation was more positive, and ensuring that, you're not sort of looking for these negative things to drive you is really important.
Yeah. So one final question that I ask all my guests is, what does it mean to you, Alyssa, to be human?
Oh, that's a hard question. I'm going to try not to overthink it.
Don't overthink it.
No. Oh, look, for me to be human is about growth and pursuing your potential. And I would say those two things have often defined my life, particularly in the mountains. And that's what inspired me all those years ago. I think, this is just the way that I do that, was climbing. But for me, it's that, excitement of pursuing the potential that I have and not seeing that go to waste. I think it's about knowing that we can overcome anything.
Thank you for listening with the amazing Alyssa Azar. A question she has inspired me to reflect on is, in all that I am doing, is it true to me? And do I have conviction? Please subscribe, review, share with friends and family, and become part of the To Be Human collective.